Hello, it's Chino here. Today I'd like to go through my game of the day from round 6 of the FIDE candidates tournament. And this one was between Ian Nepomniatchi and Liren. And we had the royal pairs in this game. So after bishop to b5, we saw Murphy's move, a6. And then after bishop to a4, knight to f6. Which is standard in this opening, and we have castles kingside and bishop to e7, introducing the closed royal pairs. Now in this position, white often plays rook to e1, which is probably the more popular response. But instead of rook to e1 and go back a move, white opted for pawn to d3 in this game. After which the game continued. Pawn to b5, chasing the bishop from a4, and after bishop to b3, d6. And now we saw quite a few moves as theory before things started to get interesting. So pawn to a3, just going back one move. It's worth noting that another popular try for white is pawn to a4 with a different type of game. And if we go back to the position after d6, so instead of this a4 move, we saw the move pawn to a3. Now black just simply castled kingside, and then we just saw continuous development from both sides. Knight to c3, knight to a5, and threatening to capture on b3, and bishop back to a2, bishop to e6. And it's just worth noting here, all these have been played thousands and thousands of times, and it's just theory. And pawn to b4, chasing the knight from a4 or a5. Bishop takes a2, rook takes a2, knight to c6, and now bishop to g5. So again, this is all still theory. Just to point out here, white wants to capture the knight on f6 to give this knight access to the d5 square without the fear of being captured. So that's the essence of bishop to g5. Let's see what happens here. Black continues with development, queen to d7, and now bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Knight to d5, the move I talked about, the white wants to play, and then a5 from black. Just going back one move, it's worth noting that with knight d5, white has a very strong knight in the center, and there's always the prospect of knight takes f6, damaging the pawns around the black king. I mean, white wouldn't do that straight away, because he'd be giving up a very strong piece, central piece, for, if you like, a bad bishop. If you notice, the bishop's on the same color square as the pawn, so it's not the most effective bishop in this position. It's also worth noting here that black doesn't mind losing the bishop to the knight, because obviously it'll be a bad bishop for a good knight. Although some players retreat the bishop to d8, but against this continuation, I think white can simply go a4, pawn takes b5, threatening winning the rook, and if pawn takes a4, queen to a1 would allow white to regain the a4 pawn and put serious pressure on that a6 pawn. So just going back to that position after knight to d5, I think bishop to d8 is ill-advised. So the popular book move here is pawn to a5, trying to define, the pawn structure on the queen side. And this is where we see white play a new move, and that move was rook to b2. I'll just quickly mention that instead of rook to b2, after the move a5. C4 is the theoretical continuation, and a few games have gone knight to e7. So I think that's a fairly solid line for both sides to play. And so just going back to that position after pawn to a5, we saw this new move, rook to b2, in the position. And here black took the opportunity to try and clarify things on the queen side by playing pawn takes b4, and now retreated the bishop. I mean, I didn't think this bishop retreat was particularly necessary. Well, white doesn't exactly want to capture the bishop on f6 because he'd be giving up a strong piece for a poorly placed piece. Anyway, so after bishop to d8, white continued pawn to c4. Notice that black would be reluctant to go pawn takes c4 because after pawn takes c4, white has this impressive, pawn formation, which would help with some queenside and pawn play. So if we go back to that position after white's gone c4, and I think this is where black starts to drift a little bit. Black played knight to d4. Now it's possible that this is an okay move, but as we'll see in the game, it creates a few problems for black after knight takes d4 and pawn takes e4. That pawn became quite weak. But just going back to that position after c4, the other alternative for black, and probably the move I would have played in this position into the knight to d4, would have been knight to e7. Now obviously that knight's trying to chase away the strong knight in the center, and it creates the possibility of playing pawn to c6. Okay, so back to the position after c4 and knight to d4, the game continuation. Knight takes d4, e takes d4. White calmly played queen to c2, and we see straight away, pawn takes b5, with some pressure on the c7 pawn is a threat. Okay, black continued developing with rook to e8. But here maybe even c6 was possible, but we'll see that move later anyway. And now pawn to g3, just creating some room, and now pawn takes c4. White correctly played queen takes c4 and putting pressure on the c7 square. And now black felt compelled to play pawn to c6, chasing the knight away to knight to f4. And after bishop g5, we kind of see the point of black's play here, because the threat is bishop takes knight, and if pawn takes knight, queen g4 check, with at least a perpetual check for black. Now, but the problem here is after knight to e2, this pawn on d4 starts to look very, 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 very sorry in this position. However, black had a few tactical shots up his sleeve. So we saw this move, pawn to d5. And after pawn takes d5, I'll just point out here that queen takes d4 would lose to bishop f6, when white would be giving up the exchange for no compensation. So just going back to that position after d5. So after d5, white continued pawn takes d5, and after pawn takes d5, queen to b3. Now black had to find some counterplay in this position, because he's got a weak pawn on d4, although it can't be captured straight away. It's a long-term weakness, and white's just simply got this passed pawn on the b file. So black started with pawn to h5, and we can see what black's aiming for here. you know, pawn to h4 with some play on the king side. But here white calmly just played pawn to b5. I mean, there's a saying in chess that passed pawns must be pushed. Black continued pawn to h4, and white just continued pawn to b6. Again, passed pawns must be pushed. And now h3. Now if we just take a moment to examine this position, this is, in some situations, this can be quite dangerous for white. Because somehow black has to get a queen, just has to get a queen, you know, to f3, you know, threatening to mate on g2. But in this particular position, black doesn't quite have the coordination or the piece placement to achieve queen to f3. And now it's instructive what white's next move is quite instructive, king to h1, and because that anticipates a queen move to f5 or g4, and the idea is this knight can go back to g1, protecting the f3 square, which we'll see in the game. And yeah, this was a critical point. So in this position, black went rook e to b8. I mean, it's probably worth saying that white's already better in this position. White just calmly played rook f to b1. So white's protecting his pawn, you know, with all his pieces. And that pawn's going to be a thorn in black's flesh. Okay, so we saw bishop to d8, so one more piece attacking the pawn. But then now queen to b5. White would be so happy if black would exchange queens, because after something like queen takes b5 and rook takes b5, we see that these two pawns are on the threat. At least one of them is going to fall with a winning game for white. Okay, so if we go back to that position after queen to b5, black avoided exchanges by going queen to g4. And here we see the move queen takes d5. Now the idea of this move obviously is to cover this diagonal, so now queen to f3 is impossible. And here black tried a few tricks, so go to a5, trying to deflect the queen from the diagonal, but obviously white won't fall for this. And then white just calmly played queen to c6. After this move, black tried rook to c5, but then queen to e8 check followed, and after king to h7, that move, knight to g1. So after all these moves, we see the justification for the king to h1 move, the knight going to g1 and covering the f3 square. And it's fair to say that black's already losing. Shaw was lost in this position. Black tried rook takes b6, but I mean white just calmly went queen takes d8. The point being that after rook takes b2, rook takes b2. I mean, white's a piece up. Rook to c1, queen to h4 check, queen exchange forced, pawn takes h4. White's virtually winning in this position. Black tried a few more moves, rook to d1, threatening to capture the pawn on d3. But after f3, I think this is a position where black resigns. Just to show you why it's futile to even try. Rook takes d3, for example, would lose to knight takes h3. Notice that rook takes f3 is impossible because of knight to g5 check. So after knight takes h3, perhaps rook to d1 check. But after king g2, I mean, it's clear that white's just simply a piece up in this position and should win with perfect play. So yeah, this was an interesting game between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Liren, and Ian Nepomniachtchi is now leading the field in the candidates. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, please don't forget to subscribe, and hope to see